We've just heard three extremely rich and diverse presentations, and it's my formidable task to summarize them. I fear I may not be able to do justice to our speakers if I were to summarize what we have just heard. So instead, what I'll try to do is I'll try to parse out a set of intersecting themes that the speakers brought to surface as they reflected on the place of the local and the global in their own curatorial practice. So what exactly does the idea of the global connote in relation to contemporary museum and curatorial practices? Or conversely, what exactly does the local denote? Is the invocation of the global only a mode of expanding the canon by including art and artists from diverse cultural contexts? Or does the idea of the global museum indeed demand a more constitutive conceptual revision? To begin then with Ada Rothenberg's words, 07 doesn't answer. But why doesn't 07 answer? For Rothenberg, the 07 emergency calls that are rarely answered serves as a metaphor for the convoluted trajectory of international collaborations, both inside and outside of post-1990s Poland. But the metaphor, I believe, can be usefully expanded to speak more broadly of the possibilities and challenges that this panel has brought to the foreground. Join me in imagining 07 not as a police radio call signal in a widely popular crime drama series aired on Polish television, but as a loose cluster of the possibilities and challenges that the speakers have described in different contexts. The question is, why does 07 not respond? Is it because 07 is in fact incapable of responding? Allow me to explicate via an argument that Andrea Gupta made in her talk. The story of modern and contemporary art, Gupta pointed out, has been primarily narrated through artistic and intellectual movements that originated in Central Europe and North America. This act of narration, still repeated in textual and oral discourses, has also engendered terminologies and a lexicon and a vocabulary to annotate and describe, classify and categorize artistic practices and movements. This has produced a specific genealogy of art that pertains to the particularized histories of Central Europe and North America. But this, nonetheless, stands in as the rule or the standard. In other words, a canon against which all artistic practices come to be measured. By the very nature of its constitution, this canon, or any canon for that matter, delimitates, binds and guards, includes some, and creates conditions for the exclusion of many others. So do classificatory and descriptive terminologies that routinely govern our engagement with art. The canon engenders a particular set of descriptive terminologies, as it were. The canon, however, Gupta points out, is not only a Westernist projection, but it is also markedly masculine. In this sense, the vocabularies, categories, and lexicon that such a canon engenders and legitimizes cannot, in fact, be extended without significant modifications to speak of artistic practices that are external to its conventional narrative registers. If we can imagine the canon to be the Polish police radio call signal 07, then 07 cannot respond precisely because 07 does not possess the requisite language of enunciation. Hence, the trajectories of Latin American art, as well as the trajectories of 20th century art from other parts of the world, can only be appended as a postscript to the European and North American master narrative. And as such, a canon is but a facet of disciplining, which is why the police radio call signal 07 seems to be an exceptionally appropriate metaphor. Then, thinking against the canon is but a form of epistemic disobedience and an intellectual insurgency that sets out to interrogate and ultimately realign the very frames of knowledge that serves to discipline. Put differently, the practice of intellectual and curatorial indiscipline is tantamount to shifting the terms of the debate. Think back to Guinta's insistence on a glossary of words, based not on Euro and North American conventions, but on terms that artists in Latin America used as they devised their aesthetic agendas. Indigenism, dematerialization, neoconcretism, constructive universalism, muralism, and so on. And words that draw on the particularities of gender, experience, and utopia. Real cities, imagined cities, utopian cities, work, exploitation, banishment, peasant insurrection, prostitution, poverty, black, indigenous, body, materiality, menstrual blood, and rape. From this list of words, it must be clear that the geopolitics of knowledge goes hand in hand with the geopolitics of knowing. Who, when, why, and where is knowledge generated? In broaching these questions through her own experiences, Anda Rothenberg shifts attention from what is enunciated to the place of enunciation. Yet, rather than a firm geographical terrain, the image of place that emerges from Rothenberg's talk cannot be fully traced onto a cartographic map. If the Iron Curtain divided Europe into geopolitical blocks, its spectacular dissolution did not conjoin places and cities, or so Rothenberg indicates. There is, she indicates, a geography of the mind, a mental map that demarcates certain places as more distant than others. This is not based on actual distance that can be calculated in kilometers and miles, but in projections of cultural geography, historical assumptions, and perhaps also networks of elective affinity. Geographical distance is but subjective, and Minsk may well appear to be much further from Warsaw than New York. But there is something that we can affirm with absolute certainty. That is the fact that the global is always elsewhere. It's never here, never on the ground upon which we stand, but resolutely elsewhere, in the distance, always in the distance. Distant both in conceptual terms and in the logic of cartography. The global then is always the other. In contrast, conceptually obverse to the global, the local stands in for the zone of familiarity that allows for a certain kind of self-construction, to put it somewhat simplistically. In turn, this sets up parameters within which knowledge is produced, received, and circulated. Or in Rothenberg's words, in Poland, we only like the songs with which we are already familiar. What this necessarily implies is that questions and concerns that arise from the specificities of a given local, conditions, even colors, our imagination of the global. Likewise, concerns that we bring to the global stem from local arraignments. Such an operation, however, cannot be fully separated out from the question of infrastructure, as Mark Coetzee seems to suggest. In the recent past, there has been an increased interest from major European and North American museums in contemporary African art. This in itself is perhaps a welcome change. Yet the localization of such collections in institutions like Tate, MoMA, or Guggenheim does little to make contemporary art accessible to audiences in Africa. In contrast, what Coetzee proposes results is a certain kind of public-private partnership that involves many agents of the South African art system. As the first museum of art of this scale dedicated to contemporary art from Africa and its diasporas, the Ziet-Mocha has a very special role to play in the local context. For it appears to seek an expansive understanding of the right to participation. And this understanding extends not just to the display of art, but it seems to me that it extends to the production of discourse by and for the continent. How successful Coetzee will be, only the future can tell. But without doubt, the conceptualization of the museum does invoke a certain kind of turbulence within existing collecting practices and existing discursive practices within the field of contemporary African art. And we might even call Coetzee's project an exercise of indiscipline that has the potential to rupture existing practices. To be sure, this rupture too can become normativized. Everything depends then on the sort of indiscipline that is in play, how it mediates public and professional discourse, and whether it aims at reproducing itself in a new disciplinary form, or whether it is content to enact multiple self-reflexive transitional moments. However diverse, ultimately, what all the speakers collectively argue is this: there was once a time when curators and scholars could assume that the knowing subject is transparent, disincorporated from known and untouched by real and imagined configurations of the world in which people and cultures are ordered. Today, that assumption is no longer tenable. A globally oriented curatorial practice, then, perhaps demands an incessant interrogation of the limits of both the unfamiliar and the familiar in a way that muddies the borders between the global and the local, bringing the other at least a little bit closer to the self. But in this panel, we have said much about what the idea of the global museum cannot entail. Before opening up to the discussion to the audience, I want to welcome the panelists to the podium, and I want to invite the speakers to articulate what their ideal of a global museum might look like, even if this is an utopian image, and what its constitutive components might be, based on their individual practices in really very disparate geographic locations.